Today's Tech Talk is one of our first Tech Talks that the London office is doing. So for us, it's quite a big achievement after, I think, nearly 3 years operating in EMEA. So we're quite proud of that. In terms of the topic, we're going to be talking about what is BeyondCorp and what does it mean to attackers. This new landscape that's going to be created from this new technology around BeyondCorp. So I'm going to hand over to Daniel and to Steve. They can introduce themselves and get the show started. So,
thank you. All right. Hey everyone. Thanks for joining us. And hopefully everyone got their fill of food and drinks and all that stuff. My name's Steve Manzuik, and I'm the director of security research at Duo Security.
Hello all. My name's Daniel Cuthbert. I've got the world's longest title, and it includes cyber, and that wasn't my choice. But I'm global head of cybersecurity research for Santander Group. So mi habla español, no, pero we'll keep it in English though, if it makes life easier.
All right, and what we're going to talk about today is we want to talk about BeyondCorp, right? So everyone's probably heard a little bit about it, or maybe you haven't. But we want to talk about first, what it is, why companies are starting to consider this architecture or this, security strategy, I guess is another way to put it. But then something we want to do that's, a little bit different is we actually want to look at BeyondCorp more from a what does it mean to attackers, right? So what attacks will BeyondCorp kill, right? So if I'm your bad guy, or if we're your bad guys attacking you, where is BeyondCorp going to stop us? But then where are the areas we're going to switch, right? So if history has taught us anything, as soon as we make something more secure or better, attackers will change tactics and find a new way around it. So we're going to walk through some of that stuff.
So I think one of my roles at Santander is I've got a small remit. I do all the security research for 133 million people and 200,000 employees. So Santander is vast, like most banks. And in 23 years, similar to Steve, I've been poning a lot of stuff. So I've now moved back into the defensive realm, and because defense is harder, like anybody can hack today. And if you look at the sad state of affairs, it's too easy to own something. I'm going to go into some examples. What BeyondCorp gives you is the move away from making it really easy to an attacker. So I know there's a few pen testers in the room. It was a joke. If you did an internal pen test or an external pen test, hour one, you've owned the AD. So the pen test starts. And that hasn't changed in a decade. It's embarrassingly easy to own internal networks, and people built up this moat and lots of protection. And what BeyondCorp does is saying, well, actually, let's move away from that. Let's wipe the slate clean. Let's build something a lot more secure. And if you look at some of the numerous breaches that happen on a weekly basis now, the actual attack isn't sexy anymore. It's not hard. I know we talked about advanced persistent threats and all the other threat intel names that people come out with, but Equifax breach, lame. Like, it was pathetic. It really was, but it happened. Target breach, lame, pathetic. OPM breach, DNC hack, all these attacks, they aren't sexy. There's no O-days being dropped. So they ask the question, how do you deal when a network has been owned? So let's say you're a large organization and you know that your network is no longer your network. How do you fix that? No firewall is going to stop that. No new thing is going to stop that. So that was kind of the whole idea behind BeyondCorp. And it works by moving the trust. So as any pen tester will tell you, when you own an internal network, you're inherently trusted as a person on that network. And that's a really bad decision. And also BeyondCorp really does raise the bar of security. And I know it's a very cliched thing to say, but as an ex-attacker, in building my BeyondCorp type thing, I look at it going, this is going to make my life miserable if I try to own it. So it's generally a better way of doing stuff.
Yeah. So real quick, what is BeyondCorp, right? So the first thing that we're going to say, and hopefully none of the salespeople in the room throw a chair at me for this, it's not a product you can buy, right? You can't go onto Amazon or go to your favorite vendor and say, give me BeyondCorp, and they can't hand you a box, right? It's really a bunch of different components and processes where you're essentially, like Daniel said, moving, you're moving where you make your trust decisions, you're also removing the single point of failure, right? So the thing we saw in common with all of the different attacks that that Daniel talked about in the previous slide was not only were they lame, and mostly email phishing based attacks, all it took was that one successful piece of that attack to give the attacker the foothold. And once as an attacker you have the foothold, it's super easy to move laterally, from system to system and look for the actual network gold, right? Attackers will always take the easiest way into an environment. It's lower risk, it's easier, less chance of getting caught. And BeyondCorp removes a lot of those easy ways and moves where you're making the decision whether or not you allow something away from the firewalls and VPNs and the network itself.
So BeyondCorp, oh, next one. Oh, no, were we right?
Oh, yeah, I was right. Yeah.
Okay. So the idea behind BeyondCorp is that you have zero trust. As in, I'm naturally a paranoid person. I don't like any human being. So therefore, if you want to access my stuff, I want to know about you, your device, who you are, and should you have access. And it puts us at odds at traditional network security architecture. Out of interest, how many here are network architects? None. If you sit in a network architecture meeting like I do on a weekly basis, you'll find that they build networks with a lot of trust. If you're on the VLAN, well, the web server should talk to the database server, and you've got an entire microservices layer that, well, they've got to talk to other things. We assume trust. And as an ex-attacker, I play to that benefit because I want to abuse that trust relationship, just like a good phishing email. If I pretend to be my group chairwoman, Anna Botin, all right? Guaranteed, if an ExCo member sends an email to an employee, they're going to click on that email. That's how phishing works, because you're not going to ignore the boss. It's an assumed trust model. BeyondCorp gets rid of that trust. It's also a combination of technology and processes. So I'm not going to sugarcoat it. BeyondCorp is really hard because you need to understand what you've got, who your people are, how they work, what the applications do, what the networks do, how they talk to each other, the protocols, the different layers. There's a lot you need to understand. It's not just, Steve said, a product you can plug in and go, we're good and golden. There's a £100,000 box. You're good to go. And it also assumes that network's hostile. And that's probably one of the biggest challenges you'll have, because when you present it to people, you say, we think the network's owned. Or like one of my old clients, when we got to the company in the US, very large US customer, admitted that that network was no longer owned by them, it was owned by the Chinese. So what they do and what they did was move around the network to try and bypass the Chinese. BeyondCorp assumes that you've already been owned. It just moves a lot of the trust away.
Yeah, and so one of the ways that BeyondCorp accomplishes that, right, is it actually makes decisions on how much it, trusts, air quotes, a user and a device. So it's no longer, hey, you had the right credentials so you could VPN, now you're on the network, so we're going to trust you. Now it's, you had the right credentials, you multi-factor authenticated, your device is patched, your device may have a certificate on it that, that you need to access certain resources. And so it starts to take all of these different factors and determine whether or not that you trust that login, that authentication, or that accessing of the resource enough to allow it to happen. And what's interesting about this kind of architecture is that you really can do what I would call like dynamic access, right? So I'll give you guys a quick example of kind of how we do things here at Duo. So when I want to get at my corporate email, my calendar, our chat server, the things that are fairly low risk if they were compromised, I can do that from pretty much any device as long as I multi-factor authenticate and as long as those devices are patched. If I want to access, say, Duo source code or something more sensitive, future product plans, things like that, well, then the bar is actually a little bit higher. And not only do I have to multi-factor authenticate, I also have to be on a corporate issued device that has the proper certificates and is also patched. And so as you can see, you're able to start building building out scenarios as to, scenarios where you would trust things and scenarios where you would not, trust things. And what's interesting about that is that you can then do dynamic access control. So say, for example, that I am accessing something that I'm allowed to normally access from any machine from anywhere. My machine, say, has, unfortunately, Flash installed on it. again, as we see probably, at least a few times a month, a new flash 0-day pops up and there's active attacks. Well, administrators can actually say, oh, wow, this is bad enough. I'm going to click this button here and now block any machine that has flash from authenticating to the, critical things. And now all of a sudden my session, I now have to re-authenticate, and it's actually going to tell me, well, hey, no, you have flash, uninstall it, go use this device, whatever, right? So you can almost instantly allow or deny access depending on, changing conditions, right? There's opportunity to do things like integrate threat intelligence as well, right? So as you start to see different conditions happen and as the risk of your organization changes, you can actually on the fly change your access policies as well. And really, like I said before, what it's doing is it's removing that whole all or nothing thing, right? Just being on a network should no longer be enough to actually access resources, right? I mean, all the attacks we've seen over the years have proven that, because pretty much every single attack, I mean, that's the one thing in common, right? Attacker gains the foothold, attacker pivots to the actual important stuff and, and steals it.
It sounds like it's pretty much paradise, and to a degree it is, almost, but there's actually a lot more moving parts. The first thing is you've got your multi-factor auth. So it's no longer a RSA style device. You've got a phone that, as Steve said, has got to be updated. If you're using Android, you can specify it's got to be a certain version, et cetera, et cetera. You've then got the key thing, device management. And if you look at any big organization, this is where a lot of them fail. What do you have on your network? Right? And the whole bring your own device and everything else has muddied the waters. So in order for BeyondCorp to work, you've got to say, right, I need to trust and know about this device. So Google got around this by saying, right, actually, we will only allow Google devices onto our network. And that's got to be a Google issued device. And it uses a cert on the device to confirm it's a Google device. And only then do we start through the process. That means trusted hardware. You can do it with BYOD, as Steve said at Duo. But if you want your more paranoid stuff, say you've got, you're a small bank and you use a integrated system like Swift built with bubblegum and old fag packets and everything else, right? You know for a fact that's shaky as hell, but it's a really important part of the global financial system. So you can say, I only will allow people to connect to Swift if it's a bank-owned device that we know about and it's got all the policies. So what you're doing is you're making it a lot harder for the attacker to start owning it. You've then also got granular access controls. So for example, with old VPN networks, you can say, right, if you've got a VPN token, you can connect into the VLAN, you've got access to everything. Well, in this case, I only want Swift people to be able to connect to a Swift endpoint, the SAG, which is on this address, but they can only connect using this device in this geolocation during these office hours, using this patch version. Do you see where I'm going? From an attacking perspective, you've made my life really miserable because I've now got to pretend to be somebody. I've got to go and physically kidnap them. We're in Mexico. I deal with that now. You've got to do all these steps because you can now say that person will only be able to connect that endpoint. Unlike traditional networks, they're on the network. You've then got other things like certificate management, which, as we saw 2 weeks ago, a week ago, where a certain CA decided to push out a lot of certificates. Certificate management is still very hard to do in organizations. It's 2018 and we still struggle with certificates. Then you've got this thing called trust engine. And this is quite cool. I want to say, hey, I don't trust you at all, except for these policies, except for this process. So you can start to really understand what users are doing on networks. And at first, what we had to do is we had to look at, right, here's an application. You have to go back to the old network sniffing. What does it do? What does it look like on the wire? How does it talk out? Should I trust this protocol? Should I not trust this protocol? And then finally, you've got policies. Like Steve just said, the Flash thing is a perfect example. In reality, nobody should be using Flash. Just kill it with fire, please. But people still do. So you can say you can only connect to this if your Flash is the latest version. So you've got a lot of granular control in a BeyondCorp style setup that you don't have in a normal setup.
So we kind of talked about, what it is and, why we feel, people need it, right? But what does that actually mean to attackers, right? So I sat down with the labs team and, talked with Daniel a bit where we kind of did some very informal threat modeling on, all right, so with this architecture, what attacks are going to be completely stopped, or maybe the result of the attack is going to be useless if it's not, if it's not stopped. But then what are the new areas, right? So, I mean, the first piece are, what are the attacks that become not worth it for an attacker, right? So obviously password theft, right? So if you have multi-factor authentication on everything, reality it is your password is practically disposable, right? It almost doesn't matter if you fall for that phish and they get your credentials, because the user's still going to get tipped off when they get that, multi-factor, authentication push. Network-based attacks. If the organization you're attacking is assuming they can't trust the network, well, that means getting on the network has zero value to me as your attacker. There's no point in me trying to maintain persistence or go after, a router or something like that that's going to keep me on your network, because you don't care about the network either. So it's not like I'm going to be able to easily pivot to other machines, on that network. Phishing is going to have to change big time, right? I mean, we're going to have to get to the level of, figuring out, ways to attack the actual phone apps that people are using for multi-factor authentication, right? Or if you happen to be using SMS still for multi-factor authentication, we'll probably start to see a lot more, of attacks on that network as well. But again, you're still fairly limited even in that scenario, especially if you're, going the ultimate paranoid route where you still need certificates and, everything else on, on the machine. The big thing that's going to become very, very important is obviously cloud security. Not only the security of the cloud provider themselves, but also how you're configuring and setting things up in the cloud. The nice advantage of a BeyondCorp architecture is that if you're an organization that is moving to the cloud, which I mean, today most are, 5 years ago, I had a conversation probably every day about whether or not you should trust the cloud. Today, it happens maybe once every 6 months, right? So I mean, people in general are just starting to trust and move to the cloud a lot more. This helps you do that because it helps remove a lot of, a lot of those threats. But again, if you don't know what you're doing, from a, configuration and setup perspective with your cloud infrastructure, you definitely could get trapped there. And these are the things attackers are looking for. I mean, we already see attackers doing, lots of, probing and looking for ways to, go after cloud services.
So I guess for me, one of the biggest benefits of BeyondCorp is that I really don't care about the lulsec skiddy idiots who use Empire today. Really go away. You're like a mosquito in the middle of the night. Don't care about you, right? Because you're easy to annoy with deception technology. I'm more worried about the people that have a vested financial interest. So Kim Jong and his merry band of hackers, Mexican cartels, generally the ones that keep people up at night. So I want them to effectively burn through as much cash and time and effort when it comes to attacking me, because I'm annoying like that. And that's what BeyondCorp gives me. Because if you're going to try and attack anything that I've got, I want you to A, get frustrated, B, get really angry, because there's nothing worse than a pissed off pen tester or attacker, and 3, burn through time. Because in doing that, right, you're going to have to start doing more advanced attacks. 1, you're going to have to go down a shotgun approach, right? So you're not going to be able to say, well, I'm going to scan the internet like lulsec did and get really happy if I saw SQL map and go to YouTube to understand how to use SQL map and own stuff that way, right? 2, you're going to have to physically kidnap something. Now, here's an interesting thing. One of my threat models was the Sinaloa cartel. So you have biometric device, and I grew up in Africa, and it seems the Mexicans are very good at this. If they want to gain access to somebody's thumbprint, they just take their finger, right? So it adds a whole new meaning to the term red team, right? But if that's the level you're going to go to, great, take somebody's finger off. But still, it doesn't matter with BeyondCorp because the finger's not really going to work much. And that asks the question, how do you start targeting these people? So for example, if we look at what Kim did with a lot of the Swift attacks, super lame attack, but it worked. They looked for people who on LinkedIn put Swift administrators, which again, really bad. They then set up either a phishing email against them, or they owned a waterhole that they knew Swift people would visit and own them that way. So it's not that hard to figure out in an organization who does that kind of stuff. But with BeyondCorp, it's a lot harder because it doesn't matter if you know that person's a Swift person. You've got to own the device, so you could possibly kidnap them or take their device. But I can guarantee, quick poll, how many of you have got keys, wallets, and a phone on you? What's the first thing you do when you can't find your phone for a couple of minutes? Shit, where's my phone? So if you're using your phone as your MFA device, you've got a very small window. So what BeyondCorp has brought for me in an attacker's perspective, whereas before, we went over the Aurora slide, didn't we?
We did, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. So BeyondCorp came about because Google owned. and Google got owned got really badly. Project Aurora, late 2008, 2009, seems the Chinese decided to own Google, and they did so. And it was only in 2010 that Google finally realized, hey, this network's not ours anymore. And that's when they came about BeyondCorp. Those attackers had a good year plus to rummage around the network, right? Now, as any good attacker will tell you, the more time you have, the stealthier you are. You don't have to be noisy. But with BeyondCorp, you've got to move fast and move quickly. In doing so, you become very, very noisy. John termed it earlier, you've got to open up all the kitchen doors to find out what's going on. You're like that drunk at 2 o'clock in the morning when you're trying to be quiet when your wife's upstairs. That's an attacker in BeyondCorp, right? So you've got to make more speed. You're going to be noisy. And if you're in a good organization, the new buzzword is telemetry. You're going to see when somebody's doing this because you can no longer do a brute force attack because it's newsy. If you start accessing stuff, you're going to start seeing all the stuff popping up in your network. So for me, BeyondCorp's great because it allows better telemetry. And it's also very hard to do lateral movement. So for example, if you own my web server or my Jira or my Slack or something else, you've owned it, well done, job done. You need to want to pivot to that box now, you've got to do the whole thing again. That's then it becomes expensive. And like I said at the start, I want it to become really expensive for an attacker to own us. That's what BeyondCorp brings me at the moment, being noisy.
Yeah, and I mean, whoops, sorry. And so there are definitely still some areas where attackers will go after you, right? I mean, yes, BeyondCorp solves a lot of the issues that we've definitely seen from past attacks. You know, like Daniel said, I mean, the fact that attackers sat on Google, Juniper, Cisco, I mean, it was something like 8 or 9 different tech companies were all owned by this Project Aurora, and all of them for, like you said, for a year plus. That is definitely going to change, but attackers are definitely going to adjust and go after some different things, right? So the big thing is the endpoints, right? So I need to, if I need to get access to your device, well, what are the weak links on the device itself? Very unfortunate to say this as a security vendor, but your security products. It's been proven a million times. Go look up a gentleman that works for Google Project Zero by the name of Tavis on Twitter and give his feed a read. He literally looks at an antivirus product and then, a day later has 50 devastating bugs with it. I mean, it's been a bloodbath as he's gone through looking at these different security products. That's pretty bad to say, right? That security vendors are actually adding to the attack surface. Now, that said, the impact of owning your device is actually not as great as it is under your normal moat and castle type architecture, because of the way Beyond works, right? You have the ability to have dynamic policies based on threats, and because you have to jump through all of the different hoops to own your target, getting persistence on this device matters way less because the device may not be fully trusted. You're still not going to get a certificate unless you're actually able to get at private keys and things like that. So again, yes, there's issues here, but attackers might not, want to care too much about that. But an area where we see today, even with traditional, network architectures, that's been a real problem for a lot of organizations is how do you deal with API keys, authentication tokens, things like that, right? Anything that gets you around, your multi-factor authentication is obviously going to be, interesting, to an attacker. And then application-based attacks we're definitely going to see a lot more of those, especially when you have apps. And there was a public example of this. I believe it was the gentleman from Thinkst talked about a editor that's very popular amongst developers, right? So if you know the tool is popular amongst developers, so that means there's developers, at giant companies that maybe your target. Well, a lot of these support plugins, and you can go and you can download, a plugin written by another developer that says, hey, this really helped me do this, just add it to your plugin directory and it'll go ahead and work inside this tool. Well, that's also dangerous from a security perspective, right? One could write a malicious plugin. One could write a plugin that looks super helpful, but behind the scenes is doing something malicious. And those are going to be the new ways to start going after people, is by attacking the apps that they use. And of course, cloud apps are definitely a target. I mean, they are today, but that's also a pretty tough target, right? Because, I mean, again, the whole point here is you've removed the script kiddies and the people that are just hitting the point and click tools. You've removed them from the discussion because there's not one of these attacks that they're going to be able to pull off, right? If anyone's going to be attacking your cloud apps, the actual cloud companies themselves successfully, I guarantee you they have funding and skill and all of that kind of stuff behind them. And those are really the attackers you want to focus on, right? So the advantage of Beyond is you get to rule out the attackers you don't care about, and you get to focus on the attackers that can actually do damage to your organization.
And I think that's the thing. If you look at or ask any SOC person what consumes most of their time, it's these lame, low-level mosquito-style noise attacks that are a worry. So Equifax, Apache struts, you couldn't just decide the patch, and well, we know what happens from there. If you remove that out of the whole equation, you've got the ability for your SOC or your NOC to concentrate on the stuff that's actually more worrying. And there's the benefit, because I think today's alerts on everything world, if you speak to any SOC person, they look 900 years old and they have a serious narcotics problem because life is miserable because there's thousands of alerts coming in. So Steve and I had a lovely chat about this, and it was quite nice to go back to the ugly criminal world. We thought, like, how would we now own, as two old men, these new style networks? APIs. So in banking, you now have open API or open banking, which is phenomenal because let's API everything, which is great. But anything to do with authorization or auth issues, that could be really bad. And if you look at a lot of applications, especially in the API world, they have been built with full trust in mind. So for example, if you tear apart most mobile banking applications and you look at the underlying code, you'll see API endpoints that may or may not allow you to interact with that API endpoint because it's trusted. The mobile app, well, nobody's going to reverse engineer that. You can access that. So bugs in that category is going to be really bad. The other thing is the cloud stuff. So we've seen now, we were talking, I think there's 40 or 50 different AWS bucket scanners in GitHub. That's the new thing that pen testers get into. They write a AWS bucket scanner. And it's quite a sad sign of the times because it obviously means that there's a lot of people putting stuff into the cloud they shouldn't do. So again, it goes back to the fact you really need to understand what stuff you've got, how you use it, and how does it communicate. If you're dumping all your secrets into the cloud and you're not hardening it, well, BeyondCorp's not going to help you because you're not doing the basics. That goes to exposed resources, permissions, and then sketchy providers. We talked about the CA example, but you need to get better at choosing who your providers are. If you're choosing a cheap CA cert who gets angry and decides to publish or email 20,000 certs, life is going to be miserable for you no matter what. And then the last one we talked about was the cloud infrastructure. There's a lot of people who now offer clouds. I mean, the three biggest ones would be effectively Google, AWS, and Microsoft. So the CPU style chipset floor, yes, it's definitely a possibility. But as Steve said, if people are going down that level, yeah, you've got to contend with Tavis and Project Zero for Google, most of Microsoft's product team for Azure, and Amazon's team. So there are hundreds of people looking at the cloud stuff. So you've got to get better than them. You've got to try and own that. The attack's a lot more harder. So you're generally probably dealing with really persistent people that are going to be, pretty good at what they're doing. That world is probably the 1% of hacking. So generally for most people, they're not going to have to worry about the cloud infrastructure. Now, knowing that tomorrow there'll be probably some ugly cloud attack that comes through and I look like a rat Ted. So
yeah, and I mean, we actually thought about deleting this bullet point because I mean, most sane threat models, you can probably ignore this, especially if you're using one of the top tier cloud providers. I can definitely say from my experience in my consulting days, because I've worked with some of these top tier cloud providers, that they've definitely thought about that, right? They've definitely thought about the scenario of someone sneaks into our data center and actually touches hardware. Yeah, they definitely have things in place, and it is a very unlikely scenario. But in some cases, you might want to consider that, especially if you've picked Bob's Cloud Emporium as your provider, right? Or some one of the smaller providers. So some of the other attacks that we think people are going to start looking at is obviously identity providers, right? So part of the BeyondCorp architecture, right, is working with identity providers, managing users properly, multi-factor authentication. Well, that makes all of those components also targets, right? So again, if you're attacking someone and you need to get past their multi-factor authentication, why wouldn't you try and attack their multi-factor vendor? makes sense. I mean, if you've raised the bar to that level of attack, that's definitely in the realm of, yeah, why wouldn't we do that? So the same advice would kind of go along with, what we say about cloud providers, right? Make sure that the vendors you're picking to be part of this BeyondCorp architecture are vendors that have thought about, hey, what happens when we become the target, because we're going to be the pivot point, right? Because essentially that's what you've done, right? You've moved those points of pivot points over to other areas where you do have to give us some trust to your service providers. And of course, the big one that we've talked about quite a bit, right, is the whole CA thing. I don't know anyone that does this perfect yet, right, or does it well. I know as a consultant, this was always an area where if we knew they had a internal CA, that that became a primary target, and it was usually easy to get at things. We've seen some very interesting bugs of management tools where you're able to actually get it to just send you a certificate for you. Things like parsing bugs, right? So we saw, going back to the identity provider attacks, we saw a bunch of SAML bugs recently, right? A couple weeks ago. Those bugs came down to the fact that you're just parsing XML. And for anyone that's done security for a long time, especially at the application, layer of security, as soon as you hear those two words together in a sentence, there's gonna be a security problem without even looking at it, right? Parsing an XML is usually always bad. It doesn't matter who wrote it, right? And in both cases, right? So here you had issues to, mess with your identity providers because of XML parsing issues. And down here, well, what about the software and hardware that's parsing those certificates? Same theory, right? I mean, we have seen historically bugs where a really long name in a certain field on a certificate causes, something to fall over, right? And they're kind of silly bugs, and in the past when we've seen them, they've maybe only been important to, say, a pen tester that already has internal access. Well, now these bugs become important to your external attackers too, right? So that's definitely an area that things are going to shift. And the whole supply chain attacks, right? So whether that's, again, going after the software that they know organizations use, or the extreme cases where we've seen in the news of counterfeit routers and things like that being sent out. Now on a network level, probably not as big of a deal anymore because you already don't trust the network. So who cares if somebody's replaced the chips on it and is sniffing all your traffic. But again, at the application and maybe computer hardware level and device level, you definitely want to care about supply chain type attacks.
I mean, how many of people audit GEM? People using Python and everything else. I mean, it's quite easy to do that kind of attack, but that just makes life a lot harder for you to defend. So there are a couple of things in my experience of moving towards BeyondCorp. My biggest experience was the whole administrative policy issues. The key thing I can recommend is there's got to be buy-in. And at first, when you suggest something like this, there's going to be no firewalls, there'll be no routers, there'll be no VPN. And generally people cry when they have no VPN because that means it's secure, right? Yeah. When you say it's going to be on the internet and, it'll be there, they're like, where's the firewall? I'm like, there's no firewall. But,
or it's on the host.
Yeah, it's UFW, good. So there's the king, you got to have the buy-in. The other thing is the assets management. This is the killer. So for example, how do you handle the absolute abortion that is Android, right? And I'm going to be blunt here. It's an awful thing from a security perspective. Google had not acknowledged this. A couple of years ago, Glenn and I found a lot of flaws in wireless. Apple were secretly fixing it. Google said, oh shit, this is going to be hard. But finally, it was fixed in Android 8, we've been told. How do you deal with that, right? And it all comes down to what do you own? What are you willing to accept, as we said at the start? Understanding what you have on the network and what users have, that's probably one of the biggest things. And if you look at any big organization, they will admit we don't generally know what people have or what's on the network. Then there's the policy thing. And I can't believe I'm now talking about policies, but a lot of policies that are easy and open are really hard. You have to understand and find rules. Say, right, I'm going to be really anal here. You can only connect to my BeyondCorp if X, Y, Z. That's the hard thing to get right at first. You then got patch management. Now, this is something that's confused me for 26 years now. So both Steve and I were talking about this earlier. We've been in a lot of clients where they'll have a policy for patch management that says high and critical will be fixed in 30 days. Mediums in 180 days. You're like, what? Like, what are you doing for half a year, right? That's where life becomes miserable. But what you can do with BeyondCorp is you can say, fine, do you know what? I'm going to push a lot of the patch management onto the user. You will only connect into this network if your device is fully patched or a .1 release behind. If it stops people doing their work, I can guarantee you they're going to be a lot more forceful and making sure their own device is more secure. So you're kind of shifting a lot of the responsibility. And I think that's one of the key things with security that I've seen is that old security was always denied, disabled, no. Modern security has to be, let's think about this, how can we get it to work? And it's a shared endeavor. So if you say to the user, you can only work, you can use your own device, you need to make sure it's patched and up to date, or you can't work. What are they going to do? They're invested in doing it. So they'll make sure their device is updated. And I am that freak who looks at people's phones on the tube to see how many red dots are above the little gear icon, thinking, man, how outdated their software is. Right? And I said, empower the user. And then finally, legacy. I was with Heather, so h@google.com. And she's a big component of BeyondCorp at Google. And it surprised me to know that Google's got a lot of legacy equipment, which at first I was like, what? It's like, you're Google. I was like, yeah, we've got legacy everywhere, mostly HR, finance, etc. There is the biggest problem. Like, how do you deal with it? And my small little bank's no different. There's legacy everywhere. We have everything from mainframes, which to those who don't remember are massive computers that cost a fortune, all the way down to microservices. A lot of the times that's very hard to do. You're not gonna be able to put a mainframe in a BeyondCorp style organization, but you still have to use it. So there's a lot of play coming in here going, right, this is really gonna push your network architecture design. What can work? What can we migrate over? What do we have to go, that will never change. We need to try and build something here because you can't ever secure a mainframe. And then the ugly one, the one that I've got a lot of experience with, is the whole PCI compliance world. Let me tell you, a regulator coming in with a checkbook and a clipboard and a suit from Primark going, sorry, I don't like regulators, going, all right, so I need to see a firewall. Where's the firewall? Computer says, no, you have to go to them all. We don't have a firewall because we've got X, Y, and Z. I think this is going to be the next biggest thing for a BeyondCorp style thing, convincing the regulators in the PCI and the compliance world, we don't have that because we've got this. We've not experienced it yet, but I can see it coming in the next year, especially with GDPR.
Yeah, in fact, I emailed somebody on the PCI Council and asked them if they've been talking or thinking about BeyondCorp, and I haven't gotten a response yet, but we'll see. But I mean, that's exactly true, right? I mean, the compliance strategy that people usually follow is, let's segment our network down so we shrink the compliance scope down to be as small as possible. Well, BeyondCorp's telling you to blow that up, right? So under BeyondCorp, I could see the argument made that, well, no, now your whole environment is in scope because, right, you don't have it segmented, right? So there's definitely going to be some interesting changes that have to happen when it comes to compliance before we can see companies fully dive in, right? The way I do see companies today getting around this is they do those mixed environments, right? They keep the, legacy, stuff still in the traditional, build your firewalls, build your VPNs, all of that, all of that stuff. But then all of the new things they're, pushing out to the cloud and pushing out to, start using Beyond. But the big key here though, right, is that you need to make sure those who control your funding for keeping things secure understand that there's still going to be a cost to those legacy environments. Just because you've switched half your environment over, or a little piece of your environment over, doesn't mean you take your eye off the ball here, right? Or things will get, way, way worse for you. The other thing, anyone that's ever done IT admin, type work or any kind of user management type work, exceptions, right? So especially coming from a MFA, traditionally an MFA vendor, where Duo got its start, we hear a lot like, oh yeah, well, our executives didn't want to deal with, hitting a button on their phone or, whatever it was. So we've added them to an exception rule and they don't have to two-factor. Sure, okay, maybe that's fine, in, your old school thing. I mean, they're still at very high risk in my opinion, but when you go to BeyondCorp, these will be your targets, right? The people that are the exceptions are the people that I'm going to attack because I know they're going to be easier than the people who aren't part of the exceptions. So the big things you need to understand as you're trying to build out, your environment to look a little bit more like a BeyondCorp architecture, is the big thing you need to understand is what connects to what, right? Who's working with what? Where is your data going, right? What do those data flows look like? That's very important because you obviously, one of the concepts in BeyondCorp is you push the authentication and the decision-making on whether or not someone should have access to that resource as close to that resource as possible. So if you don't know where those resources are and what they're doing, it's very difficult to do that. Again, we talked about asset management. A lot of companies struggle with that, today. And then, of course, microservices, right? So just like APIs, just like we see a lot of APIs being designed, assuming that they're on an internal network or assuming that they're in a trusted network, which is going to be horrible for those organizations when those APIs end up on the internet, right? Or traversing the internet. Same thing goes with microservices. My experience with microservices has been authentication, authorization. No, we don't need that. We're just this little service, and someone else will build another service that we can, use that for. And hey, if no one gets around to it, well, then I guess we just don't do it. And unfortunately, no one's really gotten around to it yet, right? So there's definitely a lot of microservices out there that are built on that theory of, oh, we'll just be running on a trusted network. It's all fine. And we already did talk a little bit about telemetry, right? BeyondCorp works really well if you actually are able to detect and respond quickly, right? So you need to understand what the logs are, where you're getting them from, where they're going, and then what they actually mean, right? And you can do things like make those risk decisions, right? So the logs can feed into one system, and then you can feed that into your policy engine and say, hey, we see this type of thing on the logs. Here's the policy we want to apply for that. Or we see this type of thing in the logs. That might be an attack. Pull the fire alarm and get the incident response people to scramble. And then we've definitely seen some issues with certificate authorities, where you do things like have internal only resources and you're trying to have properly signed certs for those resources versus external resources. Because users are accessing things externally, it's expecting to see an external IP in a certificate in some cases and causes issues, right? Wildcard certs might be the fix there. And then, of course, the last thing too is some applications just don't play nice with that architecture of BeyondCorp, because when you look at it behind the scenes, what's happening when you're accessing a web app is that you're first being redirected to, the proxy server, then you get redirected to authenticate, and then you end up, somewhere else where maybe you're, determined how much the system trusts you, and then you're going to the app. Well, some applications just don't know what to do with that many, redirects in the chain before you get to them. This one's getting more and more rare. I saw the application issue one probably 3-4 years ago. We experienced it a little bit at Duo. We used to have this joke about it. We called it the authentication loop, where we had this app that wasn't playing nice and it would just keep getting stuck in that authentication piece. But we do see a lot of those, issues being addressed over time, especially with the major apps that we see a lot of organizations using.
Except maybe Mattermost. So one of the things that we've got internally is a Slack client, because I don't trust Slack. They're not very good at security. So we moved to Mattermost in a BeyondCorp, which works fine on the Windows and Mac using Electron before the bug came out. But on the mobile app, it doesn't work. Because as Steve said, there's a weird auth loop where the app just goes, well, I want to connect to slack.whatever.com, but I'm going through 5 different boxes. Oh, I'm just going to fall over. And it does that. So I think as more and more people start moving towards a BeyondCorp type thing, the app developers are going to have to start thinking about this, that there could be 6 endpoints to an authentication endpoint. So it goes down, how does the app work? What are we connecting to? What are we looking at? There's still a long way to go with BeyondCorp, but generally I'm quite excited about it. It's probably the first time in nearly 3 decades of doing this this is a really exciting way of actually keeping attackers out.
Yeah, and I mean, with that, we went, a little bit fast, but we do have time for questions. If anyone has any, we have a little portable microphone.